No one in Ravenswood Palace dared cross the Duke's path, until a 6-year-old boy stepped into the grand gallery carrying a silver gown almost larger than himself. Beneath the watchful portraits of generations of dead dukes, Oliver Bell stopped directly before Adrian Ravenswood. Servants held their breath as the child looked up at the most feared nobleman in the kingdom and innocently asked whether he might give the gown to his mother, whose own dress had been repaired too many times to count. Adrian was ready to dismiss him, until Oliver lifted his face. The Duke froze. The boy had his storm-grey eyes. Even the nervous motion of his thumb against his finger was unmistakably Ravenswood. Adrian let him take the gown, unaware that it had once belonged to the only woman he had ever loved, and that the child carrying it away was his son. 2 days earlier, long before Oliver stood beneath the portraits of dead dukes, he and his mother were living in a narrow worker's cottage at the edge of the Ravenswood estate. Rain slipped through a crack in the roof and gathered in a chipped bowl beside the hearth. Clara Bell sat beneath the weak light of a single candle, her fingers moving carefully through layers of silk, lace, and pearl thread. The gowns spread across her table belonged to noble women preparing for the Duke's founder's ball. Each one was worth more than everything Clara owned. She had returned to Ravenswood only because a fire had destroyed the small sewing room where she once earned her living. The palace commission was meant to be temporary. She would finish the dresses, collect her wages, and take Oliver somewhere safer before anyone discovered that Mrs. Bell was not her real name. Most importantly, before Adrian Ravenswood returned from the capital, when a kitchen maid offered her a bundle of food taken from the palace stores, Clara quietly refused it. That evening, she divided their last loaf and placed the larger portion before Oliver, insisting she had eaten while he was outside. He believed her because he wanted to. Oliver watched his mother lift another magnificent gown from the table. He had seen her repair torn sleeves for poor servants without accepting payment, yet every dress she owned carried patches of its own. He wondered why she never kept anything beautiful for herself. Clara told him that silk could make a person admired, but it could never make them worthy. As she spoke, her fingers brushed the small locket hidden beneath her dress. She never opened it where Oliver could see. He did not know whose portrait lay inside, or why his mother's eyes always changed whenever she touched it. Then the estate bells began to ring, not the slow call for worship, not the warning of fire. These were the bells announcing the Duke's return. The color drained from Clara's face. She seized Oliver by the shoulders and warned him never to enter the main palace, never to wander near the grand gallery, and, above all, never to approach Adrian Ravenswood. Oliver asked why one man could frighten her so deeply. Clara looked towards the distant palace, rising beyond the rain, and told him that some doors should remain closed once they had broken your heart. But before the following afternoon ended, Oliver would cross that threshold, enter the Duke's world, and stand face to face with the man his mother feared most. Adrian Ravenswood returned to his ancestral estate, beneath a sky the color of iron. His carriage passed through the palace gates, just as the rain began to fall, but the storm waiting inside Ravenswood was far more dangerous than anything gathering above it. He had come directly from the capital, carrying an ultimatum sealed by the royal council. The duchy had no acknowledged heir. For years, Adrian had ignored the whispers surrounding the succession. He had buried himself in state affairs, military negotiations, and the endless responsibilities of his title, refusing to consider marriage after the only woman he had ever loved disappeared without explanation. But the council was no longer willing to wait. Before winter, He must marry Lady Arabella Westley and establish a lawful line of succession. If he refused, he would be required to present another legal plan for the future of Ravenswood, and if he failed to do either, his cousin Marcus would be formally recognized as heir to the dukedom. Marcus received the news with carefully practiced humility. He assured Adrian that he had no desire to inherit what rightfully belonged to another man's children. He spoke of loyalty, duty, and the preservation of the Ravenswood name. Yet beneath his calm expression, he was already imagining the day when every servant in the palace would bow to him. Lady Arabella arrived that same afternoon for the engagement celebrations. She was graceful, intelligent, and perfectly suited to the role the council had chosen for her. But it did not take long for her to understand that Adrian viewed their coming marriage as another political agreement. He discussed wedding dates with the same emotion he used when reviewing land disputes. He spoke of heirs as though they were names waiting to be added to a legal document. Whatever tenderness had once existed inside him had been buried so deeply that even Arabella could not see where it had gone. While nobles gathered in the reception halls and servants hurried to prepare for the founder's ball, Oliver was helping a young kitchen maid carry folded linens through the rear passages of the palace. He had promised his mother that he would stay away from the main house, but the kitchen maid's arms were full, and Oliver had never learned how to ignore someone who needed help. One wrong turn led him away from the servants' corridor and into a long storage gallery filled with covered furniture, abandoned portraits, and trunks that had not been opened in years. That was where he saw the gown. It lay across the top of a wooden chest, its silver fabric dulled by dust, but still shimmering wherever the afternoon light touched it. A small tag tied to one sleeve marked it for disposal. The hem was torn, and several pearls were missing, but Oliver saw none of its damage. He saw only something beautiful enough for his mother. Clara could repair any tear. She could replace missing beads and make worn things look new. Yet she had never owned a gown that was not faded, patched, or altered from someone else's discarded clothing. Oliver lifted the silver dress with both arms, nearly disappearing beneath its heavy folds. Mrs. Harrow found him moments later. The retired housekeeper's face changed the instant she recognized what he was carrying. She moved towards him, intending to explain that the gown could not leave the palace. It had belonged to someone whose name had not been spoken within Ravenswood for 6 years. But before she reached him, the gallery doors opened. Adrian entered with Marcus beside him. The servants immediately lowered their eyes. Mrs. Harrow stopped where she stood. Even Marcus's attention sharpened when he saw the silver fabric in the child's arms. Oliver knew none of their secrets. He simply walked towards the Duke, raised his small face, and asked whether he might give the gown to his mother. Adrian was already preparing to send him away. Then the child stepped fully into the light, and the Duke of Ravenswood saw his own storm-grey eyes staring back at him. For several long seconds, Adrian said nothing. The child's face was unfamiliar, yet something about him felt disturbingly known. It was not only the color of his eyes, it was the way Oliver stood beneath the weight of the silver gown, trying to appear brave despite being surrounded by adults who looked as though he had committed some terrible offense. Adrian lowered his gaze to the dress. "Why do you want it?" Oliver shifted the gown higher in his arms and explained that his mother repaired beautiful dresses for women who rarely remembered to thank her. She worked until her fingers became sore, sewing pearls onto sleeves and lace onto skirts. Yet her own clothing had been mended so many times that Oliver had stopped counting the patches. He believed the silver gown would make her happy. Adrian glanced towards Mrs. Harrow. The old housekeeper looked unusually pale, but she avoided his questioning eyes. The dress was damaged and had already been marked for disposal. There was no sensible reason to deny the boy. Still, Adrian found himself asking more questions. Did his mother work at the palace? Oliver nodded. Only temporarily, he explained. They would leave as soon as she had earned enough money to repair their leaking roof and repay the debts left by the fire. Adrian reached into his coat and removed a small purse. He offered to send it with the gown so Oliver's mother could purchase whatever else she needed. The boy's expression became serious. He did not reach for the money. His mother, he said, had taught him that they could accept kindness, but they must never sell their dignity. The words struck Adrian with the force of a memory. Years earlier, in the palace gardens, Clara Whitmore had refused an expensive necklace he had tried to give her. She had looked at him with quiet pride and told him that affection freely given was kindness. But affection that expected obedience in return was merely another way of purchasing someone's dignity. Adrian had not heard anyone speak that way since she disappeared. He studied Oliver more carefully. The boy's coat was worn but clean. One sleeve was slightly shorter than the other, as though it had been altered by someone determined to make it last another winter. His boots had been polished, though the leather was beginning to split near the toes. There was no shame in the way he carried himself, only innocence. Adrian asked about his father. For the first time, Oliver hesitated. His mother had told him that his father was a brave man, he said, but she always became sad whenever he asked why the man had never come home. Oliver had decided that perhaps his father had become lost somewhere far away. The answer awakened an emotion Adrian could not immediately name. He had spent years believing he would never have a child. After Clara left him, he had refused to imagine a family with anyone else. Even now, as the royal council pushed him towards marriage, the idea of an heir felt like another obligation placed upon his shoulders. Yet looking at Oliver, he wondered what kind of man could know that such a child was waiting and choose never to return. Oliver adjusted his grip on the gown. As he did, the heavy fabric slipped towards the floor. Adrian caught it before it fell. The boy thanked him and carefully straightened the silver folds. Then, with the solemnity of someone repeating a lesson he had heard many times, he said that his mother believed promises must be protected because a promise was a man's true crest. Adrian's hand tightened around the fabric. Those words had belonged to his father. The late Duke of Ravenswood had spoken them only within the family. He had repeated them to Adrian whenever teaching him about honor, and Adrian had once passed them on to only one other person, Clara. Adrian asked where Oliver had learned the saying. The child answered simply, from his mother. Mrs. Harrow turned away, but not before Adrian noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. He permitted Oliver to take the gown and instructed a footman to escort him safely back to his cottage. Oliver thanked him with such genuine happiness that for one brief moment, the coldness surrounding the Duke of Ravenswood seemed to weaken. But the instant Adrian turned to question Mrs. Harrow, the boy slipped through a side door. Oliver knew his mother would be angry if she discovered he had entered the palace after being expressly forbidden. He intended to reach the cottage alone, present her with the silver gown, and confess only after she had seen how beautiful it was. Adrian watched through the tall gallery window as the small figure hurried across the courtyard, nearly tripping over the gown trailing behind him. For the first time in years, Adrian was not wondering who might deceive him, challenge him, or take something from him. He was wondering who Oliver Bell truly was. He never noticed Marcus standing in the upper gallery. Adrian's cousin remained hidden behind the carved stone railing until the boy disappeared beyond the servants' wing. His usual calm had vanished. His face had grown rigid, and his eyes remained fixed upon the silver gown in Oliver's arms. The steward approached quietly, awaiting instruction. Marcus did not look at him when he spoke. That gown should have been destroyed 6 years ago. Oliver reached the cottage breathless. His cheeks flushed from the cold, and the silver gown gathered awkwardly in both arms. Clara was standing beside the work table, with a candle in her hand, when the door opened. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, ready to scold him for staying away so long. Then she saw the gown. The candle slipped in her fingers. For one terrible moment, Clara could neither speak nor breathe. The years between past and present seemed to collapse as the silver fabric shimmered beneath the firelight. She knew every pearl sewn into its sleeves. She remembered the torn place near the hem, where Adrian had accidentally stepped on the train while trying to dance with her in the empty conservatory. She remembered laughing as he apologized, and she remembered how he had taken her hands beneath the moonlit windows and promised that when he returned from war, he would make her his wife. It was the gown she had worn on the last night she believed love would be enough to protect them. Clara demanded to know where Oliver had found it. His proud smile faded as he explained that the Duke had given it to him. He had only wanted his mother to own something beautiful. He had imagined her repairing the hem, wearing the gown, and perhaps smiling, the way the noblewomen smiled when they admired themselves in palace mirrors. But Clara was already moving. She crossed the cottage, pulled an old traveling bag from beneath the bed, and began filling it with clothes. They had to leave before nightfall. They would take the eastern road, avoid the village, and find shelter wherever they could. Oliver stood near the door, watching in confusion as the gift he had brought home seemed to fill his mother with terror. He asked whether he had done something wrong. The question stopped Clara. She looked at his lowered face and saw how quickly his happiness had become shame. Her fear softened at once. She knelt before him, took his cold hands, and assured him that none of this was his fault. He had tried to do something loving, and no mother could be angry with a child for that. The danger belonged to the adults who had buried their secrets long before he was born. Clara drew him into her arms. Over his shoulder, her gaze returned to the silver gown. There was one thing she had almost forgotten. Years earlier, frightened that Adrian's family might search her room, Clara had opened a small section of the inner hem and hidden 2 papers beneath the lining. One was Adrian's written promise that he would marry her when he returned from war. The other was a copy of the letter she had sent after discovering she carried his child. She had meant to retrieve them before leaving Ravenswood, but she had been driven from the estate before dawn with no opportunity to take the gown or anything else that might have proved the truth. If the papers were still hidden inside the hem, they were the only evidence that Adrian had once promised her a future, and that she had tried to tell him about Oliver. Clara reached for the gown. Before she could examine the stitching, hoofbeats sounded beyond the cottage. At the palace, Adrian had refused to let the mystery rest. He found Mrs. Harrow in the old storage gallery and asked why she had reacted so strangely when Oliver lifted the silver gown from the chest. The elderly housekeeper attempted to dismiss it as a painful memory, but Adrian had spent too many years surrounded by deception to accept half an answer. At last, Mrs. Harrow revealed the name that had not been spoken openly in Ravenswood for 6 years, Clara Whitmore. The sound of it reopened something Adrian believed he had buried. He remembered Clara, standing in the moonlit conservatory with silver fabric flowing around her feet. He remembered her smile, her trembling hands, and the promise he had made before leaving for war. He had returned months later, expecting to marry her, only to be told she had accepted money from his family and disappeared with another man. Adrian had hated her because hating her was easier than admitting how completely she had broken him. Now a child carrying Clara's words had appeared inside his palace. He ordered his horse and rode towards the workers' cottages without waiting for an escort. Clara had just fastened the traveling bag when the door opened behind her. She turned and found Adrian Ravenswood standing on the threshold. 6 years had changed them both. His face had become harder, his shoulders broader, and his eyes colder than she remembered. Yet beneath the anger in his expression, Clara recognized the man who had once held her beneath the conservatory lights and promised she would never face the world alone. Neither of them offered a greeting. Adrian's gaze moved from Clara to Oliver, then to the silver gown lying across the table. He accused her of returning under a false name after taking his family's money and vanishing without a word. Clara stared at him as though he had struck her. She had never accepted money from the Ravenswoods. Her voice shook as she accused Adrian of rejecting their unborn child before leaving her to survive alone. The silence that followed was more powerful than either accusation. Adrian did not understand what child she meant. Clara did not understand why he looked genuinely shocked. For one breathless instant, both sensed that the story they had believed for 6 years might have been built upon a lie. Before either could demand the truth, Marcus appeared outside the cottage with several armed guards. He announced that the Duke's royal signet had disappeared from the palace. Until it was recovered, every gate on the Ravenswood estate would remain closed, and no servant, visitor, or worker would be permitted to leave. Clara looked at Adrian and believed he had trapped her before she could escape with Oliver. Adrian turned on Marcus, demanding to know why an entire estate had been sealed over a missing piece of jewelry. But Marcus was already watching the boy. Later, when Adrian's attention shifted, Marcus drew one of his men aside and spoke so quietly that no one else heard him. He ordered the cottage searched. Then his eyes settled on Oliver's storm-grey face. The boy had to be found before the Duke discovered whose blood ran through his veins. Adrian did not allow Clara or Oliver to leave the cottage. Until the missing signet was recovered, he ordered them brought to the palace, where they could be questioned without interference. Clara protested at once, but every road beyond Ravenswood had already been closed. With armed guards surrounding the cottage and Marcus watching her son far too closely, resistance would only frighten Oliver. They were placed in a quiet sitting room near Adrian's private study. Clara remained under observation, while Oliver was permitted to move between the adjoining rooms, unaware that half the household had begun whispering about the mysterious child with the Duke's eyes. Adrian claimed that he needed to question the boy about where he had wandered inside the palace. In truth, he was searching for an excuse to remain near him. Oliver entered the Duke's study cautiously. The room was enormous, lined with dark shelves and tall windows that overlooked the rain-covered gardens. Adrian sat behind a carved desk, expecting the boy to be intimidated by the silence. Instead, Oliver noticed the chessboard beside the fire. A game had been abandoned halfway through, with the Black King standing alone on one side, while most of its pieces gathered at the other end of the board. Oliver moved closer, studied the arrangement, and quietly began shifting the pieces. Adrian asked what he thought he was doing. Oliver explained that the king looked lonely and that someone ought to stand beside him. The answer silenced Adrian. He watched as Oliver placed the Black Queen near the king, then moved 2 pawns forward, as though surrounding both figures with a small family. No one had touched that chessboard since Adrian's father died. When a servant brought tea, Oliver accepted 1 biscuit and carefully broke it in half. He wrapped one piece in his handkerchief to save for Clara. Adrian told him there were plenty more. Oliver replied that having plenty was not a reason to forget someone who had less. Again, Adrian heard Clara's voice beneath the child's words. Oliver looked around the vast study, then asked why a man who owned so many rooms always seemed to sit in them alone. He had counted at least 20 doors while walking through the palace and suspected there were nearly 100 more. Adrian told him that large houses did not always contain large families. Oliver considered this, then observed that the Duke hardly ever smiled. He wondered whether smiling was forbidden once a man inherited a title. The question caught Adrian unprepared. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. The servant holding the tea tray nearly dropped it. 2 footmen outside the doorway exchanged startled glances. In 6 years, neither had heard the Duke of Ravenswood laugh. Clara had come to collect Oliver when she witnessed the moment from the corridor. For one fragile instant, the years disappeared. She saw the young man Adrian had once been, the man who had teased her beneath apple trees, danced with her in an empty conservatory, and spoken of building a home filled with children and music. Then Adrian looked towards Oliver, and fear returned. If he discovered the truth, he could claim the boy as a Ravenswood heir. The law would favor his title, his wealth, and his name. Clara had spent 6 years protecting Oliver from hunger and hardship, but none of that would matter if the Duke's family decided she was unfit to raise him. She had already been driven from Ravenswood once. She would not allow them to take her child as well. Before she could enter the room, Lady Arabella approached from the opposite corridor. Clara immediately recognized the woman whose engagement to Adrian had brought half the kingdom to Ravenswood. Arabella did not look at Clara with contempt. She asked whether Oliver had been treated kindly, and quietly assured her that no child should be frightened over a missing signet. Her gaze moved briefly towards Adrian, who was still listening as Oliver explained the proper way to arrange a lonely king's army. Arabella understood at once that Clara was not merely another seamstress. There was history in the way she watched Adrian, pain too deep to have come from a passing acquaintance. Arabella asked no intrusive questions, but her kindness unsettled Clara more than cruelty might have. This was the woman Adrian intended to marry, yet she appeared to understand that part of him still belonged to someone else. The fragile calm ended when Marcus entered with the chief steward and 2 guards. The Duke's signet had been found. It was lying beneath a bundle of thread inside Clara's sewing basket. The basket was carried into the corridor and opened before them. Resting between silver needles and folded ribbons was the heavy ring bearing the Ravenswood crest. Clara stared at it in disbelief. She had never touched the signet. She had not even entered Adrian's private chambers, but Marcus reminded everyone that she had returned under a false surname and had attempted to leave the estate moments after the ring disappeared. Then he turned his attention towards Oliver. With carefully measured concern, Marcus suggested that Clara might have returned to manipulate Adrian using a child whose resemblance could awaken old sympathies. Perhaps the missing signet was only the beginning. Perhaps she intended to forge documents, claim royal privileges, or present Oliver as something he was not. Adrian's expression hardened. He refused Marcus's demand that Clara be taken to the dungeon. There was no proof that she had stolen anything, and no one would treat her as a convicted criminal before he had investigated the matter himself. Instead, he ordered that she remain in a guarded chamber inside the palace. To Clara, the difference meant nothing. 6 years earlier, Adrian's family had condemned her without hearing the truth. Now, once again, she was surrounded by guards while he stood between her and the door. She looked at him with the same wounded disbelief that had haunted his memories for years. Oliver clung to the silver gown as the guards prepared to escort his mother away. Marcus ordered one of them to take it, claiming every item from the cottage must be examined. The guard pulled the gown from Oliver's arms. Its damaged hem caught against the buckle of his belt. The old stitching tore open. Something small and yellowed slipped from inside the lining, struck the carpet, and folded beneath Oliver's shoe. No one else seemed to notice. Oliver looked down and saw a piece of paper marked with faded wax. Instinct told him that it belonged to his mother and that Marcus must not see it. While the adults argued, he bent as though adjusting his boot, snatched up the paper and pushed it beneath his coat. Moments later, Clara was led away. Oliver remained in the corridor, frightened and alone, one hand pressed against the secret hidden over his heart. The only evidence Marcus had failed to destroy was now in the possession of a 6-year-old boy. Oliver waited until the corridor had emptied before moving. His mother had been taken to a guarded chamber, the silver gown had disappeared into Marcus's possession, and every servant who passed seemed too frightened to meet his eyes. The palace no longer felt grand to him. Its high ceilings and gilded walls had become part of a maze built to keep him away from Clara. With one hand pressed against the folded paper beneath his coat, Oliver slipped through the adjoining rooms until he reached Adrian's private study. The Duke stood before the fire, staring at the royal signet that had supposedly been found inside Clara's sewing basket. Something about the discovery troubled him. It had been too convenient, too perfectly timed, and Clara's outrage had not resembled the panic of a guilty woman. Adrian turned when Oliver entered. The boy said nothing at first. He simply crossed the room, reached beneath his coat, and placed the yellowed paper on the desk. The outer sheet had been folded around a second document. Time had weakened the creases, but the writing remained visible beneath the candlelight. Adrian recognized the first page immediately. It was the promise he had written before leaving for war. His own signature stood at the bottom, accompanied by the private seal he had used only for correspondence meant for Clara. In that letter, he had promised to return, seek the council's permission, and marry her before the first winter snow. For 6 years, Adrian had believed Clara had discarded those words as easily as she had discarded him. The second document was dated several weeks after his departure. The handwriting belonged to Clara. Adrian read the first line, and the room seemed to close around him. She had written that she carried his child. She had begged him to return, before his family separated them forever. Whatever others thought of her, she had insisted that their baby had been conceived in love and deserved to be acknowledged without shame. Adrian read the message again, then a third time. The original seal had been broken. Someone had attempted to close it again, but the wax did not match his own. A faint crest remained pressed into one corner, too damaged to identify, yet clear enough to prove that the letter had been opened before it ever reached him. Clara had not disappeared without explanation. She had tried to tell him, and Oliver was not merely a child who resembled him. He was the child described in the letter. Adrian looked towards the boy standing before the desk. The same grey eyes stared back at him, uncertain and frightened. For the first time, the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was standing inside his study, wearing patched sleeves and waiting for someone to return his mother. Adrian ordered Clara brought to him privately. When she entered, guarded and pale, she expected another accusation. Instead, she found her old letters spread across his desk, and Oliver standing beside the fire. The fear in her expression told Adrian that she remembered hiding them. He asked her what had happened after he left for war. For several moments, Clara could not answer. 6 years of pain had been forced into silence, and speaking of it now meant reopening every wound she had struggled to survive. At last, she revealed that Marcus and the former estate steward had come to her shortly after her pregnancy became known. They carried a letter bearing Adrian's signature. It claimed he regretted their relationship, denied any responsibility for her child, and wished never to see her again. Clara had believed it because the seal appeared genuine. Marcus had then threatened her father's position and reputation. He warned that if Clara remained at Ravenswood, her child would be removed after birth and raised elsewhere to avoid scandal. If she resisted, both she and her father would be accused of attempting to trap the future duke. Terrified of losing her baby, Clara fled before dawn. Adrian listened without interrupting. Then he told her what he had found upon returning from war. A letter, supposedly written by Clara, claimed she had accepted money from the Ravenswood family and left with another man. The former steward had confirmed the story. Marcus had stood beside him, offering sympathy, while Adrian's future collapsed around him. Neither letter had been real. Neither abandonment had occurred. Someone had built a wall of lies between them and then allowed 6 years to pass while they suffered on opposite sides of it. Adrian apologized, but Clara's expression did not soften. An apology could not return the nights Oliver had gone to sleep hungry. It could not erase the fevers she had faced alone, or the questions their son had asked about a father who never came home. It could not restore 6 birthdays, 6 winters, or the first steps Adrian had never witnessed. Clara had survived because she stopped expecting anyone to rescue her. Now that Adrian knew the truth, she feared the Ravenswood family would decide Oliver belonged to the dukedom more than he belonged to his mother. Had Clara revealed Oliver's identity earlier, Marcus might have found them. Had she returned willingly, the family might have taken her son. Faced with the same danger, would anyone truly blame her for choosing to disappear again? Adrian promised that no one would separate her from Oliver. But somewhere beyond the study doors, Marcus had already learned that the hidden letter had survived. His plan changed at once. A letter alone could expose deception, but it could not legally establish Oliver as Adrian's son. For that, the royal council would demand a recognized birth record and witnesses. Oliver's birth had been entered in the register of a small village chapel beyond the Ravenswood woods. Marcus sent 2 men into the night with instructions to seize the book before Adrian could reach it. Hours later, Adrian was still examining Clara's letters when an orange glow appeared beyond the palace windows. The chapel bells began ringing through the darkness. By the time Adrian saw the smoke rising above the village, the record that could prove Oliver's birth was already surrounded by fire. Adrian reached the village chapel before the flames had completely consumed the roof. He rode through smoke thick enough to sting his eyes, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and forced his way past the men struggling with buckets at the entrance. Heat rolled through the chapel in violent waves. Burning timber crashed across the aisle, and sparks rose around the altar like a storm of red stars. The register room had suffered the worst of it. By the time the fire was brought under control, shelves had collapsed into blackened heaps, parchment had curled into ash, and the section containing births from the year Oliver was born appeared to have been destroyed. Adrian searched through the remains with his own hands. Soot darkened his coat, and blood marked his fingers where broken wood had cut through his gloves. But he found nothing bearing Oliver's name. The timing was too precise to be accidental. Someone had learned about Clara's letter, discovered where Oliver's birth had been recorded, and reached the chapel before Adrian could protect the evidence. Yet suspicion was not proof. and proof was exactly what the royal council demanded. By morning, the council's envoy arrived at Ravenswood earlier than expected. Lord Marcus had prepared carefully for him. Before Adrian could explain the fire or present Clara's intercepted letter, Marcus produced a sworn statement from a man claiming Clara had once lived under his roof as another man's companion. According to the document, Oliver could have been fathered by someone else entirely. The statement was false, but it had signatures, dates, and the appearance of legitimacy. Marcus did not need it to survive a thorough investigation. He needed only enough doubt to prevent Adrian from naming Oliver before the council. The accusation spread through the palace with astonishing speed. Servants whispered that Clara had returned under a false name, carrying a child deliberately chosen for his resemblance to the Duke. Noble guests wondered whether she had hidden the gown herself, forged the letters, and arranged every emotional discovery to trap Adrian before his marriage to Lady Arabella. By midday, Clara was summoned before the council envoy, Marcus, Arabella, and several senior members of the household. Adrian defended her character without hesitation. He declared that the signet had almost certainly been planted and that her letters showed clear signs of interference. But when the envoy demanded whether he was prepared to recognize Oliver immediately as his lawful son and heir, Adrian could not give the answer Clara needed to hear. Without the original register, a credible witness, or enough time to expose the false statement, any public declaration could be challenged. Worse, if the council ruled against him, Marcus might gain legal grounds to remove Oliver from Ravenswood as evidence in a succession fraud. Adrian insisted that he needed proof before acknowledging the boy before the council. To Clara, the careful explanation sounded painfully familiar. 6 years earlier, she had been told that her word was not enough. Now, even after everything Adrian had learned, their son still stood before the world unnamed. She did not hear the danger Adrian was trying to prevent. She heard only that he still could not claim Oliver. Marcus offered a solution wrapped in false mercy. If Clara withdrew any claim upon the Ravenswood family and left the estate permanently, he would ensure the accusations of theft and fraud were abandoned. Oliver's name would remain free of scandal, and Clara would not face imprisonment. Adrian rejected the proposal immediately, but Clara understood what Marcus was threatening. If she remained, Oliver's childhood could become a public spectacle. Every resemblance, every word, and every detail of his birth would be examined by men who saw him not as a child, but as a weapon in a battle over inheritance. For Oliver's sake, Clara agreed to leave Ravenswood forever. Lady Arabella found her afterwards. She offered no empty comfort and made no attempt to defend the political engagement. She simply told Clara that she believed her and would delay the official announcement for as long as possible. It was not enough to defeat Marcus, but it gave Adrian a little more time. Oliver, however, understood none of the strategy unfolding around him. From behind a half-closed door, he overheard Adrian speaking with the council envoy. He heard only the words that until proof was found, the Duke could not acknowledge him before the council. The rest of the conversation disappeared beneath the sound of his own heartbreak. Oliver had imagined that perhaps the lonely Duke might truly be his father. He had remembered the laugh in the study, the chess pieces gathered around the solitary king, and the strange tenderness in Adrian's eyes. Now he believed Adrian was ashamed of him. Later that afternoon, one of Marcus's servants approached him in the eastern corridor. The man claimed Clara was waiting beyond the gardens and intended to leave before the palace guards stopped her. Oliver followed without question. He crossed the winter garden, passed through a narrow gate, and disappeared into the woods, before anyone realized he was missing. When Clara returned to her guarded chamber, she found the room empty. Oliver's small satchel was gone. The palace erupted into confusion. Servants searched the halls, guards rode towards the village, and Adrian ordered every gate reopened so the surrounding roads could be examined. Near the frozen river, they discovered Oliver's cloak caught on the branch of a dead tree. Beyond it, a line of small footprints crossed the snow and vanished into the darkness. The bells announcing the Founders' Ball began to ring before the search party had even left the riverbank. Their sound traveled through the winter darkness from the illuminated palace, calling nobles towards music, ceremony, and the council's decision. By the end of the evening, Ravenswood would either have a lawful succession plan or Marcus would be formally recognized as the next duke. Adrian was expected to stand before the royal council within the hour. He turned away from the distant palace and followed Oliver's footprints into the woods. Marcus rode after him and warned that abandoning the most important gathering of his reign would be interpreted as weakness. The council might conclude that Adrian had allowed a private scandal to overcome his duty to the duchy. If he failed to appear, he could lose control of the succession entirely. Once, that threat would have stopped him. Adrian had spent his life protecting the Ravenswood name, believing his title was the one thing no betrayal could take from him. He had sacrificed tenderness to preserve authority and hidden every wound beneath duty. But somewhere ahead of him, his 6-year-old son was alone in the freezing darkness. Adrian told Marcus that the council could take the title if it wished. He would not lose his child simply because pride had kept him seated beneath chandeliers while Oliver needed him. Then he rode deeper into the woods without looking back. Clara refused to remain behind. She mounted a servant's horse and followed Adrian along the frozen river, calling Oliver's name until her voice broke against the trees. Every abandoned footprint terrified her. Every snapped branch became evidence of danger. She had protected her son through hunger, illness, and 6 years of hiding, only to lose him within sight of the palace she had feared returning to. As the search moved farther from Ravenswood, the grief Clara had contained finally erupted. She told Adrian what his absence had cost them. Oliver had been born in a rented room with no family beside her and no physician she could afford. Clara had returned to work before her body had healed because there was no one else to buy food. She had sewn through fevers, hidden unpaid bills beneath her mattress, and smiled whenever Oliver asked why other children had fathers waiting outside the schoolhouse. Each time a Ravenswood carriage passed through their village, she had taken him indoors. She had lived with the fear that someone would recognize his eyes, report them to the estate, and allow Adrian's family to claim him as an heir, while casting her aside as an inconvenience. Adrian absorbed every word without defending himself. He could not change the nights she had survived alone. He could not give Oliver back his first steps, his first words, or the birthdays he had missed. All he could offer was the truth he had been too proud to admit. For 6 years, he had held on to his hatred because anger was easier to endure than grief. If Clara had betrayed him, then his suffering had a reason. Accepting that she might simply have stopped loving him had seemed unbearable. Now he understood that she had never abandoned him. They had both been prisoners of the same lie. A cry from one of the search riders cut through the woods. Fresh carriage tracks crossed Oliver's trail and led towards an abandoned hunting lodge on the northern edge of the estate. The building had belonged to the former steward and had remained unused since his dismissal years earlier. No light shone from its windows, but smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Adrian ordered the riders to surround the lodge. Inside, Oliver sat on the floor, with his hands bound loosely before him. Marcus's servant had promised to take him to Clara, but instead he had delivered the child to two men waiting with a covered carriage. Their plan was simple. Oliver would be driven towards the mountain road, where the carriage would be pushed into a ravine. By morning, his disappearance would appear to be the tragic result of a frightened child fleeing into the night. The men had not expected Adrian to abandon the ball and come searching himself. The lodge door burst inward. One of the abductors seized Oliver and dragged him towards the rear exit, while the other attacked Adrian with a hunting knife. Adrian had no weapon drawn. He caught the man's wrist, but the blade sliced across his side before he forced the attacker against the wall. Clara reached Oliver first. The second man pulled the child away and stumbled towards the waiting carriage. Adrian followed, despite the blood spreading beneath his coat. As the man attempted to climb into the driver's seat with Oliver, Adrian dragged him down and placed his own body between the child and the horses. The frightened animals surged forward. Adrian pushed Oliver clear just before the carriage struck him and threw him into the frozen ground. For one breathless moment, Clara believed he had been killed. Then Adrian lifted his head and reached for Oliver. He did not ask whether the child could prove anything before the council. He did not speak of heirs, titles, or birth records. He held Oliver against his chest, as though the boy's life mattered more than every stone in Ravenswood Palace. Watching them, Clara finally saw what Adrian's apologies had not yet proven. He was prepared to bleed for their son. The abductors were restrained, and the lodge was searched before they returned to the estate. In a locked room behind the steward's old office, one of Adrian's men discovered a heavy dispatch box concealed beneath loose floorboards. The box bore the initials of the former Ravenswood steward. Its contents transformed suspicion into certainty. Inside lay the original church birth register, removed from the chapel before the fire began. Oliver's entry remained untouched, naming Clara Whitmore as his mother and Adrian Ravenswood as his father. Beneath it were every letter Clara had written during Adrian's absence. None had reached him. There was also the forged rejection sent to Clara in Adrian's name, along with records of payments made to the men who forced her from the estate. Another document contained instructions for creating the false witness statement that questioned Oliver's parentage. At the bottom of the box, they found an order bearing Marcus's mark. It directed the steward to steal Adrian's royal signet and plant it inside Clara's sewing basket. Marcus had not merely known about the deception, he had designed it. A physician examined Oliver as soon as the group reached a nearby keeper's cottage. Apart from the marks around his wrists and the cold he had suffered, the child was unharmed. While checking his shoulder, the physician noticed a small crescent-shaped birthmark beneath his collarbone. The mark had appeared among the men of the Ravenswood family for generations. It was recorded in old medical ledgers belonging to Adrian's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. Oliver carried not only Adrian's eyes, but a sign written into the bloodline itself. Yet Marcus was no longer in the woods. The instant Adrian chose to continue searching, Marcus had returned to the palace alone. He told the council that the Duke had abandoned his responsibilities over the claims of a fraudulent seamstress and an unrelated child. As Adrian's wound was bound and the evidence gathered, the founder's ball bells rang for the final time. Inside the grand ballroom, Marcus stepped towards the royal council. He intended to be declared heir before Adrian could return with the truth. The grand ballroom of Ravenswood Palace glittered beneath 1,000 candles, but the celebration had already begun to feel like a trial. Nobles lined the marble floor in embroidered silks and military dress. Royal officials stood beneath the banners of the duchy, while members of the council gathered near the raised platform where the future of Ravenswood was about to be decided. At the center of it all stood Marcus. He had changed into formal court attire and arranged his expression into one of solemn reluctance. Beside him, the royal envoy prepared to announce that Adrian's continued refusal to secure the succession had left the council with no choice but to recognize Marcus as the lawful heir. Marcus claimed Adrian had abandoned the ceremony because grief and obsession had clouded his judgment. He described Clara as an ambitious woman, Oliver as a convenient deception, and the Duke's search through the woods as proof that Ravenswood was no longer governed by reason. Several councillors began to listen. Then Marcus turned towards Lady Arabella, expecting her to stand beside him and confirm that Adrian had neglected both his engagement and his duty. Arabella remained where she was. In a clear voice that carried across the ballroom, she announced that no marriage agreement could proceed, while accusations of fraud, abduction, and tampering with the succession remained unresolved. She would not allow her name to be used to strengthen a claim built upon unanswered questions. Marcus's confidence faltered. Before he could respond, the great ballroom doors opened. Music stopped. Every face turned towards the entrance. Adrian stood beneath the archway, pale from blood loss, but still upright. His coat was torn at the side, and a fresh bandage showed beneath the dark fabric. In his arms, wrapped in a heavy cloak, was Oliver. Clara walked beside them, carrying the damaged silver gown. The sight of the three of them silenced the room. Adrian crossed the ballroom without acknowledging the whispers. He placed Oliver gently beside Clara, then approached the council's table and laid down the evidence Marcus believed had been destroyed. First came the original church register, with Oliver's birth recorded beneath the official parish seal. Then came Clara's intercepted letters, still bearing the marks of having been opened and resealed. Adrian placed his written promise of marriage beside them, followed by the forged rejection Clara had received in his name. The payment records came next. They documented money given to the men who had driven Clara from Ravenswood, payments made to false witnesses, and instructions ordering the royal signet to be hidden inside her sewing basket. Finally, Adrian opened the Ravenswood family medical ledger. Across generations, it recorded the same crescent-shaped birthmark Oliver carried beneath his collarbone. Marcus dismissed everything as a fabrication. He claimed Adrian had manufactured the documents to justify his attachment to Clara and place an illegitimate child in the line of succession. He argued that the papers had been discovered too conveniently and that a desperate woman could have forged any signature. Then, Mrs. Harrow stepped forward. For 6 years, fear had kept her silent. That silence had allowed Clara to be condemned, Adrian to be deceived, and Oliver to grow up without his father. She would remain silent no longer. Mrs. Harrow testified that Clara had been forced from the estate while Adrian was at war. She confirmed that the silver gown had remained locked inside the palace from that night until Oliver discovered it in the storage gallery. Clara could not have placed the letters inside it after her return because she had never possessed the gown again. The council examined the wax on Clara's pregnancy letter. Beneath the later seal, a damaged imprint remained. It matched the crest on Marcus's private signet. Marcus insisted that the mark proved nothing. In his anger, he declared that Clara's warning about the child being taken had merely been the hysterical invention of a frightened woman. The room went still. That sentence had appeared inside one of Clara's sealed letters, a letter Marcus claimed he had never opened. He realized his mistake too late. The royal envoy asked how he could know words that had never been spoken publicly. Marcus attempted to change his answer, but the composure he had worn for 6 years finally shattered. He accused Clara of destroying the future that rightfully belonged to him. He claimed Oliver's existence had stolen the dukedom before the child was even born. With his guilt exposed, Marcus ordered the palace guards to seize the boy. No one moved. Marcus lunged towards Oliver himself. Adrian stepped between them. In front of the royal council, the nobility, and every servant who had ever feared him, the Duke of Ravenswood declared that Oliver was his son. Whether the council granted the boy a title that night, or denied him one forever, Oliver was his blood, his responsibility, and the child he should have protected from the beginning. The declaration ended Marcus's final defense. He was arrested for treason, fraud, abduction, and attempting to corrupt the lawful succession. The men who had served him were taken into custody, and the former steward's records were placed under royal protection. Yet Adrian barely watched Marcus being led away. His attention remained on Clara. 6 years earlier, he had promised her a future while standing above her as the heir to Ravenswood. Since her return, he had questioned her, confined her, and expected his word to repair wounds his pride had helped deepen. This time, he did not issue an order. Before the assembled court, Adrian lowered himself to one knee. He did not ask Clara to marry him. He did not demand that she forgive him because the truth had finally been uncovered. He asked only for the chance to earn back the trust that deception had stolen and his silence had failed to protect. For the first time, the cold Duke of Ravenswood did not stand before Clara as a man expecting obedience. He knelt before her as a father asking for time, and as a man willing to spend the rest of his life proving that he had finally learned the meaning of his own family's words. A promise was a man's true crest. Marcus's arrest did not heal 6 years of separation in a single night. The truth restored Oliver's name, and within weeks, the royal council formally recognized Adrian as his father. Oliver Bell became Oliver Ravenswood, the acknowledged heir to the dukedom. Yet Clara did not move immediately into Adrian's chambers, nor did she accept the future the palace suddenly expected her to embrace. Forgiveness, she told him, was not the same as forgetting. Adrian understood. For the first time in his life, he did not attempt to command the outcome he wanted. He gave Clara time, respected every boundary she placed between them, and apologized, without asking, when her anger would finally end. He began by clearing the name of her late father. The physician, who had once been accused of encouraging Clara's supposed deception, was publicly honored for his years of service, and the false charges attached to his memory were removed from the Ravenswood records. Then, Adrian purchased the abandoned building where Clara's sewing room had burned. He rebuilt it as a proper dressmaking house under her control, with warm workrooms, fair wages, and apprenticeships for women who had no family wealth to protect them. He offered Clara ownership rather than charity. With Oliver, Adrian moved even more carefully. He did not surrender the boy entirely to tutors and governesses. He taught him chess, walked with him through the estate, and listened patiently as Oliver asked questions no court official would have dared to ask. Why did noblemen wear uncomfortable shoes? Why did the palace need so many spoons? And why were poor villagers expected to bow before men who had never learned their names? Oliver still slipped into the kitchens to share pastries with the servants. He still saved part of every meal for someone who might need it later. Adrian allowed him to remain close to the people he had known before becoming an heir, because he did not want the palace to take away the kindness poverty had taught him. One evening, Adrian found Oliver alone in the gallery where they had first met. the restored silver gown stood nearby, waiting to be returned to Clara. Oliver looked up and asked whether he should call Adrian Your Grace, like everyone else, or Father, like other boys did. Adrian lowered himself until they were eye to eye. He told Oliver to call him Father only when his heart was ready. The boy studied him for a moment, then wrapped both arms around his neck. That night, for the first time, Oliver called him Father. Clara witnessed enough quiet moments like that to understand that Adrian's transformation had not ended when the council applauded him. He was changing when no audience was present, when there was no title to defend and no reward guaranteed. Months later, Clara agreed to marry him. Not because he was a duke, not because Oliver had become an heir, but because Adrian had finally become the man who chose his family, when choosing them might have cost him everything. Their wedding was held in the small village chapel after its damaged roof had been rebuilt. There was no enormous royal audience, only trusted friends, loyal servants, and the people who had stood beside Clara when she possessed nothing. She wore the restored silver gown. When Adrian saw her walking towards him, the years seemed to fold together. The night of their first promise, the morning she disappeared, and the moment their son returned, the gown that had carried the truth between them. Adrian told her she had never needed silver silk to look like a duchess, but he would spend the rest of his life being grateful that their son had found it. Their first official family portrait showed Clara in the silver gown, Adrian beside her, and Oliver standing between them, with one hand held by each parent. In later years, the gown remained preserved inside the private Ravenswood chambers, not because it was the finest dress in the palace, but because one innocent request had reunited a mother, a father, and the child whom lies had kept apart. Do you believe Clara was right to forgive Adrian? Or were 6 lost years too painful to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Heartbound Duke Tales for more unforgettable stories of hidden heirs, forbidden love, and cold-hearted dukes brought to their knees.